Ancient Egypt didn't rise the way you think it did. It appears almost too sudden to be normal. Writing, architecture, and organized kingdoms didn't slowly develop over time like most civilizations. They emerged with surprising speed. That alone raises a deeper mystery. How does something so advanced form in a land that should have made survival extremely difficult? Because Egypt was surrounded by endless desert, yet everything depended on one river, the Nile. Without it, nothing would exist here. No cities, no farming, no civilization, just emptiness. So was Egypt's rise truly natural? Or was it something far more unusual happening in the right place at the right time? And if it began like this, what really shaped its story? How a lifeless desert created a civilization. Ancient Egypt shouldn't have been able to exist here. On both sides lay endless desert, silent, dry, and seemingly impossible for sustained human life. A place like this should have remained empty, but instead, something extraordinary cut through it. The Nile River. This single river changed everything. Every year, it flooded in a predictable cycle, spreading dark, fertile soil across an otherwise lifeless landscape. What should have been barren ground became workable land. What should have been emptiness became a narrow corridor of opportunity. This is where the transformation begins, because this natural cycle didn't just allow survival, it forced structure. People had no choice but to settle along the river's edge, not widely, not freely, but tightly packed into a thin strip of habitable land trapped between desert walls, a civilization compressed into a narrow line of life. At first, these were small communities, but as the river continued its cycle year after year, something shifted. Farming became stable, food became predictable, and survival became organized instead of uncertain. This stability changed everything. Small groups turned into villages. Villages expanded into towns, and towns gradually formed structured centers of control. Not because the land was generous everywhere, but because it wasn't. Everything depended on proximity to the Nile. And that is where the real fragility appears. Because when a civilization depends entirely on a single river, it also depends on something it can never fully control. If the Nile's flooding changed even slightly, the entire system would feel it immediately. Yet despite this extreme dependence, Egypt didn't collapse. It expanded, organized itself, and became one of the most powerful civilizations in ancient history. How does a civilization built on such a fragile lifeline become one of the strongest powers the world has ever seen? The hidden system that built ancient Egypt's power. Ancient Egypt didn't just rise, it organized itself into one of history's first true systems of power. What began as scattered farming communities slowly transformed into something far more structured. As agriculture became stable along the Nile, it produced more than just food. It created surplus. And surplus changed everything, because once survival is guaranteed, something new emerges: power. Because in ancient Egypt, food was not just survival, it was influence. Whoever controlled resources controlled people, and whoever controlled people controlled the direction of the entire society. This simple reality pushed Egypt towards centralization, where smaller regions were gradually absorbed into larger governing structures. Over time, this led to political unification, turning divided territories into a single organized state. From there, Egypt didn't just expand, it evolved into a coordinated system. A system where every part had a purpose. Writing was developed not for creativity, but for administration, tracking harvests, managing trade, and maintaining order. Bureaucracies formed to regulate resources and taxation. Architecture grew beyond shelter or utility and became a visible expression of authority and stability. Step by step, society turned into a fully interconnected structure. But what makes this transformation so striking is not just its speed, it's the illusion it created. From the outside, Egypt looked unshakable. Strong leadership, monumental construction, advanced organization. Everything suggested permanence, as if the system could not break. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, everything was tied to a single force it could never fully control: the Nile. And that is where the real tension begins, because the same system that created Egypt's power was also the source of its deepest vulnerability. The more organized it became, the more dependent it grew on a natural cycle it could not influence. The secrets hidden inside the pyramids. The pyramids look like solid stone, but they are not fully understood even today. What makes them so fascinating is not just their size, but the contradiction they represent. Built in an ancient world with limited tools, yet aligned with precision that still challenges modern engineering. Massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, were moved and positioned in ways that continue to raise questions instead of final answers. But the real mystery goes deeper than construction. It lies in intention, because the pyramids were never just buildings. They were part of a larger system where belief, authority, and knowledge were combined into one structure. Every angle, every alignment, and every measurement seems to reflect purpose rather than randomness. And here's where the contrast becomes even sharper. A civilization surrounded by desert emptiness created structures that feel mathematically ordered, astronomically aligned, and symbolically precise. It feels less like simple construction and more like a system designed to reflect control over chaos itself. But the most intriguing part is what we still don't fully understand. How did such knowledge appear so early in history? Some explanations point to highly organized labor systems capable of extreme coordination. Others suggest advanced understanding of mathematics and astronomy for their time. But no single explanation fully removes the sense of mystery surrounding them. And that is what keeps the pyramids so powerful. Because when you look at them, you are not just looking at ancient structures. You are looking at evidence that something deeper was at work, something we still can't fully piece together. And maybe that is the real question. Not just how they were built, but what kind of understanding made them possible in the first place. When pharaohs were believed to be gods, in ancient Egypt, power wasn't just political, it was believed to be divine. And that belief changed everything, because the pharaoh was not seen as an ordinary ruler chosen by people. He was believed to be a living god on earth, a direct connection between the human world and the forces that controlled it. And once that idea takes hold, something powerful happens. Authority stops needing explanation. People don't question a god. And that is where control becomes something far deeper than force. It becomes mindset, a system where obedience is no longer demanded, it is accepted as natural order. From that point, religion and governance became inseparable. The pharaoh stood at the center, followed by priests who interpreted divine will, then officials who managed society, and finally, farmers who sustained everything below. Every level of society was connected, not just by law, but by belief. And this is the key to understanding Egypt's stability. Because when a civilization believes its ruler is divine, it doesn't just obey structure, it protects it. The system begins to sustain itself through perception. Stability is no longer enforced from the top, it is reinforced from within. But beneath this powerful illusion of permanence, there was still a quiet truth. The entire structure still depended on physical reality, food, water, agriculture, and the Nile's unpredictable cycle. No matter how divine the system appeared, survival was still tied to natural forces it could never fully control. And that is where the contradiction begins to form. A system that feels unshakable on the surface, but is still dependent on something fragile underneath. And now, the question can't be ignored. Was it ever truly divine? Or just a system that looked unbreakable from the outside? The hidden cracks. Inside a powerful civilization. Ancient Egypt looked unbreakable, but its strongest phase may have been the moment the cracks first began to form. At the surface, everything still appeared stable. The Nile continued its cycle, agriculture still functioned, and the system held its structure. But underneath that appearance, something subtle was shifting, something that didn't show immediate consequences. The first sign was not collapse. It was inconsistency. The Nile, once predictable and reliable, began showing slight variations. Flood levels no longer followed perfect timing. Some years brought weaker water flow. Others disrupted the rhythm that farming depended on completely. And in a system built entirely around timing, even small shifts carried weight. Agriculture, which had once operated with certainty, started to feel pressure. Harvest cycles became less reliable. Food production, once steady, began to carry uncertainty. And when food becomes uncertain, every layer built on top of it starts to respond. But the system didn't break. It adapted. Storage methods improved. Resource control became stricter. Administration tightened its grip over distribution. On the surface, this looked like strength, like a system growing more advanced. But internally, it was something else entirely, a response to growing pressure. Because systems don't always collapse when they weaken. Sometimes they just work harder to hide the weakening. And that is what makes this stage so important. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. But inside, the entire structure was slowly shifting into a state where maintaining balance required more effort than creating it in the first place. And this is where the real danger begins. Because civilizations don't usually fall in sudden moments. They weaken quietly until stability is no longer real, only remembered. Life in the Age of the Pharaohs. In the Age of the Pharaohs, everything depended on one force, the Nile, and that single dependency shaped every part of life in the land of the pharaohs. Nothing existed independently from it. The river was not just a source of water. It was the rhythm that controlled existence itself. When it flowed steadily, life expanded. When it weakened, everything tightened. And because of this, people lived in direct alignment with a natural system they could never fully control. Daily life followed this rhythm. Farmers worked the land that appeared after the Nile's floods, planting crops like wheat and barley in soil enriched by the river. Their entire year was structured around timing, waiting for floods, preparing for harvest, and adjusting constantly to nature's unpredictability. This created a society built on order, but order based on uncertainty. Because even though life looked structured, it was always dependent on a force that could shift without warning. Above this foundation, society was clearly organized. Farmers formed the base of survival. Officials managed resources and taxation. Priests maintained spiritual and cultural order. And at the center stood the pharaoh, seen as the figure who connected all levels into one unified system. But this structure did not remove uncertainty. It only organized it. Because the Nile remained unpredictable beneath everything. A strong flood meant abundance. A weak one meant struggle. And this constant variation shaped not just agriculture, but thinking, planning, and survival itself. Still, life continued to grow. Communities expanded along the riverbanks. Trade routes formed between settlements. Culture developed. Writing emerged, and one of history's most advanced early civilizations slowly took shape. But underneath this progress, there was always a silent awareness that everything, food, stability, order, and even power, rested on something fragile and uncontrollable. And that is what defines life in the Age of the Pharaohs. Powerful enough to build a civilization, but fragile enough to reshape it at any moment. Stability begins to collapse. The land of the pharaohs looked like it was still in control, but it was no longer truly stable. What appeared unchanged on the surface was slowly shifting underneath. The same rulers still governed, the same system still functioned, and daily life continued as it always had. But the foundation supporting it was no longer operating with natural balance. Because stability doesn't collapse all at once. It fades into imbalance. The first signs were subtle. The Nile, once predictable and consistent, began to lose its reliability. Flood patterns shifted slightly. Some years delivered less water than expected. Others arrived at the wrong time. And in a civilization built entirely around this rhythm, even minor changes created growing pressure. This is where the system begins to weaken internally. Agriculture was the first layer to feel it. Harvests became less consistent. Fields required more effort to produce the same output. Storage systems were used more frequently, and distribution became increasingly controlled. Slowly, what once worked automatically began requiring constant management. And this is the turning point most systems fail to recognize. The system stopped working naturally and started being maintained. From the outside, however, nothing looked like collapse. In fact, the structure appeared more organized than before. Rules became stricter. Administration became more detailed. Control became tighter. But this wasn't strength. It was an illusion of control. Because when a system begins to weaken, it often compensates by appearing more organized than ever. And that is what makes this stage so dangerous. Stability was no longer something that existed on its own. It had to be enforced, managed, and constantly preserved. Every layer of society was now working harder just to maintain what once happened effortlessly. And once a civilization reaches this point, it is no longer evolving freely. It is resisting decline. So the real question becomes impossible to ignore. How long can a civilization survive when stability is no longer natural but forced? Ancient Egypt didn't just rise, it organized itself into one of history's first true systems of power, a system built step by step through agriculture, surplus, and the ability to turn food into control. As resources grew, power became concentrated. Small regions merged into one unified state. Bureaucracy formed, writing developed, architecture expanded, and slowly everything began working as a single interconnected system. But beneath that strength was a quiet dependence, because the entire system was built around one force it could never control: the Nile. And that is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. From the outside, it looked like stability, order, permanence. But inside, it was an illusion, because every layer of power was tied to something unpredictable. And that leads to the real realization, because the system that made Egypt powerful was also the one thing it could never control. And that is the story of the land of the pharaohs, not just a history of pyramids and kings, but a reminder that even the greatest civilizations are shaped by forces far beyond their control. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient Egypt, make sure to like, subscribe to Brainy Bites, and turn on notifications for more deep historical stories like this. See you in the next story.